Okay, welcome everybody. I know it's still maybe just barely 6 o'clock, but I want to get you going as quickly as possible so that you have the maximum amount of time to hear from our guest here, she's the financial aid director at Simmons University. Amy Staffier is her name. She knows far more about financial details than anyone in the counseling department. We know general information and we do share that with students, but she's really your best expert on the nitty-gritty part of the process and tips, and she'll be taking questions as well. If you weren't able to be here tonight or you know someone who wasn't, this is being broadcast on BCAT and recorded as well, so people can watch it there. So I am one of the guidance counselors, Emily Minty. I want to share just super briefly with you, separate from financial aid but related, our scholarships. So the majority of our scholarships are posted during senior year. They're usually, our local donors post their applications in March of senior year, and usually they're due by the very beginning of April. And we do hold an assembly with the seniors as well as offer help sessions to walk them through that process. How many of you have heard of the Adopt a Class program? Quite a few, okay. So to be honest with you, that is just one of nearly 200 different scholarship opportunities in town, but it is a really special one because it's one where if your son or daughter just volunteers for the minimum amount of hours of Adopt a Class events, they are guaranteed a scholarship from that particular program. So that is that they either volunteer 2 hours per year at an Adopt a Class event throughout high school, or if they've missed 1 year where they didn't do 2 hours, they can make it up by just having a total of 16 hours. So that's the Adopt a Class program. Again, it's just one of many. On our guidance blog, there is a link all about the scholarship program, so you can visit that. And we post all the scholarship applications, including Adopt a Class, on the Naviance website as well. So under Naviance, it's under the colleges tab. It's not immediately obvious, but the students or you would click on colleges and then scholarships and money and scholarship list. And right now, there's actually several scholarships listed there that are not local, but they're national contests with deadlines in June or July or August. And there are a few of those on there that are open to younger students as well. So that might be something you could check out if you're looking for something to do this summer. But I'm going to pass it over to Amy. One other warning before she gets going is around 7 o'clock. It's possible we're going to have a little overlap with some band students starting to come in and set up for a 7:30 rehearsal that they have. So just ignore them. They're going to hopefully be fairly quiet, but just to give you warning about that. And so here's Amy Staffier. Thank you.
All right. So yeah, a little bit about myself, just quickly to give some background. I have been doing this for a long time. I began actually in the financial aid office at Harvard. I was there for 21 years full-time. I was associate director of financial aid. I did admissions and oversaw our work study as well. And then last May, I took on the role at Simmons as the director of financial aid. And I have been doing these presentations as a volunteer service for the past, I think, 19 years, which seems unbelievable to me that it's been that long. But really, my philosophy is this is something that I do day in, day out. I completely know that it can be an overwhelming, stressful process, and so I want to be able to provide information to parents. So I always enjoy doing these, and typically they're done in the fall, but this is kind of a test to do it in the spring before, because it really is getting so crunched in that fall time with some changes that have happened with financial aid and when you can file. And so it's crunching up a lot of the parent meetings. So hopefully this is a good time to do it for all of you. I don't work for MEFA. As I said, I am doing this as a volunteer service. MEFA is the Massachusetts Educational Financing Authority. It's a not-for-profit state authority that was really put into place about 30 years ago at the rising cost of education, really people advocating that they needed some support. So MIFA does programming like this that they offer free for all high schools in Massachusetts. They also offer support and programming for guidance counselors. And then they also have, you may have heard of the 529 plan, so college savings plans. They do have some loan funding as well, but they're also just a resource for you. You can sign up. They do have, there's a website, but you can actually sign up for their emails. MIFA.org is where you can do that. I've signed up for those myself. They're not overwhelming. It's about twice a month, and it's really during that admission and financial aid season where they're just giving you tips. Again, I've signed up for them myself, and they are useful. So tonight we're going to be talking about really the types and sources. So what is financial aid and where does it come from? We will go through the application process, most specifically the federal form that everyone will fill out if you're applying for financial aid, the FAFSA form, but I'll talk about other forms as well. How financial aid decisions are made. I often will say in these presentations, it depends, because it really does depend on the school. So when you ask me questions and you may hear from me, you know what, it depends. And then I'll give you an example of how that may be. But each school can award aid in different ways and does award aid in different ways. So it's important to know that. Excuse me, paying for college, so paying that cost, we'll talk about the options above and beyond financial aid coming from the school, and then give you some information about resources. At any point, if you have a question, please feel free to just raise your hand. But what I also always do is say, if you don't feel comfortable asking a question, if there's something that you just want to ask off mic, I am willing to stay at the end and I'll answer any questions you have. So jumping right into types and sources of financial aid. Basically, as we all know, it is money to help pay the cost of college. That's what financial aid is. And it really comes from three main categories. So you have grants and scholarships. So that's gift money that is free and does not need to be repaid. Then you have work study, which that oftentimes can be confusing. You know, in my total career, that's often something that people are trying to figure out what exactly that means and why is it financial aid, because it really is a student getting a job on campus typically. But what it is that the federal government actually allots money to institutions. Every institution has a different amount, so you actually may get a potential work study award at one school and not at another. Because it's not evenly distributed amongst all schools. And schools will award to students, you know, a ceiling that they can earn up to. The federal government basically subsidizes up to 75% of the student's wages. The student doesn't see a difference, but that is why that is called financial aid, because it is money that's coming from the government. And then there are student loans. You know, there's parent loans as well. But these are the three main buckets of what make up financial aid. This isn't necessarily, you know, this is a set presentation, and I'll be honest as I go through the presentation, this isn't necessarily my favorite slide or doesn't really give you all that much information, but it's really kind of just the general landscape of where funding is coming from. So, you know, the reality is that, you know, student loans do make up a significant portion, but when you add up the various grants, buckets, those also make up, you know, a fairly good amount. Work study really is fairly small. You know, veterans benefits are also something that is financial aid, because if a student is a veteran or a past benefits from a parent, you know, that's available for school. And then there are federal tax credits, so the amount you pay in tuition, there is a credit that is available, you know, that year after you start paying that. Aid can be awarded in one of two ways. It can be awarded based on merit. So it's some reason that the student is getting that award. It may be an academic reason. It may be, an athletic. It may be some other talent. Maybe the student is a super tuba player, going with the band reference coming in later, and the school is awarding them some money, and it's based simply on that. It may or it may not be renewable. That's something that should be clearly outlined on any communication you get from the school. And if not, always get in touch and ask. So for instance, if it's an academic scholarship, the student may need to maintain a certain GPA in order to keep that scholarship. Not necessarily offered at every school. And sometimes there's a separate application. One thing I do like to point out is, and I'll just use my school as an example, students are in the admission process automatically considered for the merit scholarships, but there is a particular kind of special scholarship that is full tuition, room, board, and then there's a stipend as well for research. And students actually have to apply for that by a deadline, so that's a completely separate process. So that's one of the most important things that I talk about is researching, right? What is available at each and every school so that you don't miss out on our opportunities. I'm just gonna, because that actually is in something that I put together. I was asked to do a presentation at a conference for like guidance counselors last year, and it was kind of helping people through the financial aid process. And I put a lot of thought into how that would work, and I'm a checklist person. So are most of you parents of juniors? Yes, great. Because that's actually probably the perfect time to be starting to utilize this. So it's 3 different checklists. The first one is all about researching schools and researching financial fit. So as you go through the process of looking at schools, and sometimes that may be happening right over this summer, maybe you've already done a little bit of it, but I feel it's very important to be looking at the financial side of it as well, along with looking at the academic fit and the personal fit for the student. And so if anyone wants one of those, they can grab it. If I don't have enough, I can email it to Emily. And but that first list is really all about researching and the different tools that are available and that you should utilize in order to do that research. Okay. Yeah, and that application deadlines may be as early as November. That's another thing that's incredibly important throughout the whole process, whether it's merit aid, need-based aid, which we'll talk about, is making sure you know what deadlines are and that you're meeting those, absolutely, because it can mean the difference of, some aid and not having aid. So need-based aid, this is the other way in which aid is awarded. All federal aid, all state aid, and a significant portion of institutional aid is awarded based on need. So that is looking at income and asset information that the family reports on their application. Eligibility is determined by a standardized formula. I don't love that bullet point, only because there is this federal form that you need to fill out, and there is a standard formula to come up with what's called an expected family contribution. But some institutions, in awarding their own aid, may use another form, and that formula is slightly different. I often find it to be a little bit more generous. So a school may use that when awarding their own institutional dollars, which they have every right to do. So I do just like to point that out that, yes, there is a standard federal formula, and all federal aid and state aid would be utilizing that, but institutions may make some adjustments in awarding their own institutional dollars on need. Includes grants, loans, and work study. And then there is this caveat that students must be making satisfactory academic progress in order to continue to receive federal and often institutional aid. So think of it, I suppose, as when I said if it was a merit-based scholarship and it was an academic scholarship and they had to maintain a certain GPA, typically you're going to have for a merit scholarship somewhere in the range of, maybe a 3.0 in order to retain. Satisfactory academic progress, the government defines that. You have to at least be at a 2.0 by sophomore year. So if a student drops below that, they would lose their eligibility. Typically, there's an appeal process, but something good to note. So where does this money come from? Obviously, the federal government is where some of this funding comes from. The grants that are available through the federal government are for the neediest families. Typically, a family with an income of $50,000 or less, a majority of Pell Grant students, that's kind of just a good baseline. If you have more than one student in school, it could be, you could be coming from a higher income family and still be eligible for a Pell Grant, but that at least kind of sets, a bar. And additionally, if your family is much larger, that may make a difference as well. The work-study funds come from the federal government, and then student loans as well would be coming from the federal government, as well as any of those tax incentives that I spoke about. In my mind, I have a hard time thinking of that as financial aid because it's not directly affecting your tuition bill, but for the purposes of this presentation, they throw that in there. The state of Massachusetts also has some funding. Sadly, the state of Massachusetts is one of the, and I don't know if it's because we have so many institutions, but as far as being ranked for the level of aid they provide to their residents, we're actually pretty low on the list. They have something called the Mass Grant. It's very similar to the federal Pell Grant, which again is for the neediest families, based on filling out that FAFSA form. There's some scholarship available, tuition waivers. The loan program that the state has is very, very small. When I was at Harvard, we had an allotment of about $30,000. We don't have anything currently at Simmons. Again, that's a need-based loan. It does have a 0% interest rate, but that's something that I don't even try to highlight so much because it really is something that's small. Also, colleges and universities, that's where, oftentimes you're going to see potentially a larger chunk of grant and institutional aid. Some schools may have loan funding available for students, but it's not typical, so you shouldn't go off thinking that every institution would have that funding available. I know at Simmons, we have a very small pot that we can use kind of more in emergency cases, but it's not something that families can rely on. And then there are other agencies. You already heard a little bit about outside scholarships, and definitely that's something that students should try to go for. Typically what I've seen over the years is that the information and the scholarships coming out of the town and out of the high school kind of get funneled out. That's where we typically see students coming in with some of those dollars. In a later slide, when we're looking at a sample financial aid award, I will talk about the question that sometimes we'll get, is it worth the work? Because students do have to put work in often to get those scholarships, whether it's filling out, an application, writing an essay, or whatever. But I'll hit on that question when we look at a financial aid award, and you can see visibly how it can be worth the work. These are just some scholarship searches you can utilize. Many years ago, it was a book in the library that had hundreds of scholarships in there that you'd have to go through. So these websites are similar, that you can search through a database, right? And they're all free resources, which is important. Some of the things that I have heard over the years, for instance, with fastweb.com, so the student goes in and builds a profile about themselves, and answers various questions, and then it's going to do the work of seeing, do you meet the qualifications of these scholarships, and if so, then they're going to email the student those scholarships and say, you may be eligible for these, and here's how you apply, right? If the criteria is really simple, you have to be from Massachusetts, or you need to be male, or whatever. So, you know, you're gonna get all of those. So students, the only feedback is like, it could be overwhelming because you get a bunch of these, and you have to kind of weed through and figure out, okay, which ones should I apply for? So, as I said, I've been doing this presentation for, I think, 19 years, and this year, so they mixed up the presentation and they threw this slide. It used to always be at the end, and it really throws me off because it seems like an odd time to talk about it. But here we go. So the federal direct student loans, these are loans that the government has available for students, for undergraduate students. When a family fills out that FAFSA form, that really is the only application for these loans. When you receive a financial aid award from an institution, the institution itself will be then alerting you to your eligibility for the loan. There's no credit check involved for the student. These students can get that loan. There are caps on the loan, so a first-year student could not borrow more than $5,500. A second-year student can not borrow more than $6,500, and then $7,500 junior and senior year, so it is capped. Family students always have the choice to borrow that full amount, not borrow at all, or borrow a smaller amount. The subsidized and unsubsidized, this is why I kind of find this slide to be hard to talk about here, because I haven't yet even talked about the formula and determining need. But as long as there is some level of need, which is determined by taking the cost of attendance of a school, subtracting out this estimated family contribution, which we'll talk about, and that kind of determines that need, a student is eligible for, in the first year, up to $3,500 that's subsidized, which means that actually the federal government is paying the interest on the loan until the student actually goes into repayment. I don't know how many years ago it was. I think it was, just last year, but it was probably 10 years ago when people were complaining about the limits on the loans and that they were too small. And what the federal government came back with was, okay, we'll increase it by $2,000 for each of those years, but it's unsubsidized. So when I say for a first-year student, the maximum you can borrow is that $5,500, that's true, but you would probably see it in two line items as long as you have need, which would be a $3,500 subsidized and then a $2,000 unsubsidized. Unsubsidized means, excuse me, the interest is accruing from the time it's dispersed. So typically that would be in September. And the interest can be paid quarterly or it can be capitalized, meaning added onto the loan. Of course, that means that you're paying more for that loan if you're tacking that interest on. So if you can pay the interest, fine. The interest rate is a fixed interest rate for the life of the loan, but the interest changes for the next year on July 1st. We did just find out recently that for the 2019-2020 year, the interest rate is actually going to be a little bit under 5%. So someone borrowing in that year would have a loan that I think it's like 4.8 something percent. But it would remain fixed for the life of that loan. No payments, no monthly payments are due. If it's subsidized, no interest, no payments, and interest does not begin to accrue typically until 6 months after graduation. That would only be different if a student decided to withdraw or take some time off. They may go into repayment, but if they go back to school, they can defer those payments. Additionally, you can make payments on the loan or pay the entire loan off at any point in time, and there's no penalties or fees for doing so. All right, so the application process. excuse me. So again, this is a newer slide that they put in here. This is something that can be utilized through MIFA's website, should you want to. What I used to always say when I would talk about the application timeline is, again, me being a checklist person, you know, deadlines are incredibly important. And every school may have a different deadline, and every school may have different items that you or the student actually needs to do in order to apply. So for me, it was helpful to write that out, write down each school. So now there is this tool that you can utilize, or you can do it yourself, or the student can do it themselves, but just writing down what the institution is, what is required, and then what that deadline is, so that you have it all on one page and can kind of all be on the same page, pun intended. Very important, I already said it about deadlines, and it bears repeating continuously to make sure that you're meeting those deadlines. I have been in meetings over the years with colleagues across the state, working in different schools, where, you know, when I was at Harvard, it was, oh, you know, it's okay if you didn't meet the deadline. And it was completely fine. And then sitting in a meeting with colleagues where it was, we hold to that deadline because we have a limited pot of money, and that's what we're going to utilize. So you don't want to miss out on anything. So make sure that you're meeting those deadlines, absolutely. And so great that you're here so early and you keep hearing that message. Standard deadlines, February or March. You know, some schools, because we've gone to this earlier process, and I'll talk about that with the FAFSA being available earlier, some schools bumped up their deadlines, most didn't, but many schools will try to get information out, you know, particularly if you do an early application in November, you know, they'll accept information. So don't, I guess I would just say, don't keep that February, March timeframe in your mind. I would say make sure you're looking at the details of each individual school to know what their individual deadline is and what they're looking for. So the FAFSA form, which I've been referencing, is something that does need to be completed each year if the student is applying for aid. I will say over the years it has gotten a lot simpler to complete. There also is free help available. Excuse me, I am, oddly enough, one of the tri-chairs of something called FAFSA Day, which is something where we have, for the past maybe 10 years, had sites available in Massachusetts, staffed by volunteers, most of them from either, some come from a high school or a college, and then some from the financial aid office, to just be there to help people fill out the FAFSA form. So we'll be in computer labs, typically in a high school or college, have them available. And sometimes I've found over the years, as I've done this, it's that the student or the parent, they're able to get through it, but just knowing that someone is there, and if they have a question, that they can just ask. So know that that help is available and out there. The FAFSA becomes available October 1st of a student's senior year. So it used to be, so now we're probably in the third or fourth year of something called prior year, and this earlier FAFSA start. So it used to be that families couldn't start filling it out until January 1st of senior year. Talk about stressful. And you had to fill it out based on your income for the year that just ended the day before. And you're putting in tax information. No one has their taxes done at that point. So that was incredibly stressful for families, trying to figure out and put estimates in there, trying to meet a deadline of February. Well, should I use estimates? Should I use my accurate figures? So President Obama had done something which was good. Let's open the FAFSA October 1st, and students and families will use prior year income information. So if you are applying next year on October 1st, you'll be using 2018 income information. So come October 1st, even if you don't fully know all the schools that the student's applying to, you could, in theory, have that form filled out because hopefully you're not on extension on your tax return for 2018. So that is a nice thing, a nice benefit there to have that and can kind of get that done. This past October, they created an app so you can fill your FAFSA out on, it's called My Student Aid. I downloaded it, I checked it out, it's fine, and you know, it seemed easy enough to use. It seemed to still provide, you know, if you can see on this one right here, these lines right here, one of the things that I really like about the FAFSA is as you're filling it out, it actually provides good information on the side. It's a help and hints section. So for each individual question, it's going to tell you it's line, you know, whatever on, say, on your W-2 or where you're pulling it from. So it does give good explanation. And on the app, I thought I was losing that, but then I realized if I clicked, excuse me, on that button, it gave me that information. What I find particularly helpful having that app, and what I've been doing is encouraging students to download the app because it's more than just filling out your FAFSA. When you click on those lines, it brings up on the main page, it brings up a whole set of options. So you can fill out your FAFSA form, you can log in to your student loan portal. So if the student has now started borrowing loans, it's going to have the total amount of loans they've borrowed. It's going to tell them, you know, what that looks like for a monthly payment when they go into repayment. It will tell them who their lender is. So I think that's a powerful tool for students to have, you know, in their hand and to be able to look at that. And they're going to be adding more information there as well. Some financial literacy tools also. So that's my plug for that app. Something that can be done ahead of time is to get an FSA ID. So the student and at least one parent needs an FSA ID in order to complete the FAFSA form. Think of it as your electronic signature. It's how you log in to fill out the FAFSA form. It's how you log in to sign off on the FAFSA. It's how the student will use that to log in to check on their loans, to sign for their loans. And if a parent borrows a federal parent loan, they would use that FSA ID as well for that process. The IRS data retrieval tool. I apologize that I keep having to clear my throat. When you're filling out the FAFSA form and you get to a section, there's a section for the student as well as the parent where it asks about income information. The first question is, you know, did you file, or what's your filing status for a 2018 tax return, which would be, if you answer, yes, I completed my 2018 tax return, it's going to have a pop-up that comes up and says, would you like to transfer over to the IRS site, and it will upload your information right into the FAFSA, the data points that it's asking for, which are AGI, taxes paid, and some untaxed income, if it's there, that's on the front page of the tax return. And so, you know, it makes it, you're not required to do it. It strongly suggests that you do. It makes it somewhat easier because you know that it's pulling in the correct data. And then, I don't think it's on this slide, but we'll talk a little bit about something called verification. So families are randomly selected to go through something called verification, which typically the institution would, if you haven't done the data retrieval tool, we're going to have to require you either to do that or to send us a tax transcript so we can just verify that that information is correct. So what information is reported on the FAFSA? It's going to ask, it begins by asking a lot of demographic information about the student, so name, Social Security number. Make sure you get the Social Security number correct. A couple of years ago, I had this situation where with a set of twins that had come at Harvard, and they had completely jumbled up the Social Security numbers of the two students, and it took me, half a year to try to fix that because they had aid that was awarded and dispersed, and it was kind of a nightmare. So that's something that just make sure that number is correct. It asks for citizenship status of the student, and a lot of these questions, why they're asking is because, and like example, one of the questions is, are you male? So in order to be eligible for federal aid, a student has to be a U.S. citizen or permanent resident. The student has, if they are male, has to be registered with Selective Service. So that's why they ask some of these questions. It's going to ask about the colleges where the student is applying. So as I said, it does open October 1st. And if you wanted to get it out of the way, you could do that. But then the question is, oh, what if my student adds a school, decides they want to apply somewhere, or what if I don't know all the schools? You can apply and just put one school on, that's fine. You can always go back into the application and you can add schools, and the information immediately will electronically be sent to those institutions. You can list up to 10 schools on the FAFSA at a time. If the student wants to add more than 10 schools, typically, a school is going to get the information within 2 days. You can remove a school, and then you can add a school on. What I always just caution people is when all is said and done and the student knows exactly where they're going, just make sure that that school is still listed on the FAFSA form. So it's going to ask information about parents. And so who is the parent? They've clearly defined that. So if I've had situations where I had a grandmother filling out information because the student was living with them, that's not, that shouldn't be how that plays out. It would be biological parents or adopted parents if they are living in the same household. So, and whether or not they've made so many, they've kind of broadened it or made it more clear. So if a parent is living in the household with another biological parent, whether or not they're married, and this would include same-sex couples, both of their information should be on the FAFSA form. If a parent is divorced or separated and they are living in a separate household, I have had situations where they said, well, my spouse is actually in the basement, but we're divorced or separated. And the way the rules are, we're supposed to include that as with both people's information. So if divorced, separated, and living separately, it's just the custodial parent's information. If that custodial parent is remarried, it's their new spouse's information as well. They're going to be asking about income information again, 2018. They will ask about, for both the student and the parent, and if a student doesn't file, that's fine. I would say a large majority of our incoming students are not working or have not filed a tax return, and you just answer that. It will ask about both taxed and untaxed information, income information. And again, the instructions for each question outline how you should be answering it. So for, say, untaxed information, what that would include. It will ask and have specific line items to clarify what they're asking about. They'll ask about parent and student assets. So this is going to include savings, checking, investment, other property. So a parent's primary home, the equity in it does not count as an asset. If a parent has a second home, a rental property, vacation home, what have you, that is to be included as an asset. If a family lives in a multi-family home, let's say it's a two-family, it would be half the value should be included as an asset. Any 529, so college savings accounts, should be reported as a parent asset. That's a good thing. The parent's assets are assessed at a much lower percent than student assets. Student assets is about 20% of student assets go into this expected family contribution, where it's closer to 5 or just under 5% on parent assets. So you don't include the primary home. You do not include the value of life insurance, value of retirement, but on the flip side, you do include as untaxed income any money that you put into a retirement account yourself. So typically that's going to show up on a W-2 form in box 12, or if you're self-employed. And actually those 2018 tax returns look so drastically different. I was always used to it being in that block on the front page. But you know, you would know if you're self-employed, you're putting into a KEO or another account. And then if you own a family business that is owned by your family and has less than 100 employees, you don't include the value of that business either. And another item is that debt is not reported at all. In the actual federal formula, it takes into account your taxes paid. It generates a number for state tax and local tax. These are all items that then reduce that income to come up with an expected family contribution. Additionally, based on your household size and number of students, there's a basic kind of living allowance as well that's built in there. But there's no place on the federal form that you're reporting any sort of debt payment that you may have. On the profile form, which is a different form some schools may require, that asks for more information. We'll look at that form briefly. But on this federal form, this is really it. Additionally, if you have more than one child in school, that's going to basically cut that expected family contribution in half, one for one child and one for the other. Are there any questions on the FAFSA form? Yeah. Great question. So the question, just to make sure everyone heard it, is on the 529 account, it said include all 529. And so the question was, does that mean if I have two 529 accounts, one for each of my children, do I include the full value of both? And yes, you're supposed to put the full value of both. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is then, is that at a lower rate? So what I said was, it's a good thing that you're reporting the 529 as a parent asset and not a student asset, because parent assets are assessed at a lower rate than student assets are within the formula. And it really is a parent asset. The student is the beneficiary and the parent holds that. Now, if a grandparent actually open the account and they're the owner of the account and the student's the beneficiary, then it shouldn't be reported as a parent asset in that case, if that is someone's situation. All right, so the CSS profile form, I'm not gonna lie, this form is a lot more complicated than the FAFSA form. There's not necessarily a lot of help out there, so there's not a profile day as there is with the FAFSA, but only about 200 schools across the country require you to fill out this form, so it's not necessarily as common that you're filling the form out. I've sat with people before, and you know, I always like to go through processes with people so that I can speak about it. I also dealt with it on the other side when I was at Harvard. We don't have the form at Simmons. So I know that can be challenging because it asks for a lot more information. It's also not free, where the FAFSA form is free no matter what to fill out. The name itself is free application for federal student aid. The profile is $25 for the first school and $16 for any additional school that you're sending it to. There is a fee waiver process built into filling out that form. So there's a set of questions in the beginning. And so if you are eligible, so typically what I hear is if you're eligible for a fee waiver for the SAT, you'd be eligible for a fee waiver of the profile, and then it's not going to ask for payment at the end. This also becomes available October 1st. The website is cssprofile.org. You can, I feel like I opened that water and I don't think I ever drank it. I'm just going to take a sip. Okay. You can, again, search the website of the institutions that the student is interested in. It should be clearly listed what forms are required. Again, every single school is going to require that FAFSA form. So no matter what, if you're applying for financial aid, you're going to have to fill that form out. But it would then also list whether or not they also require the profile. And what they're doing with the profile form is they're using that to award their institutional dollars. So it asks for a lot more information. It also, different from the FAFSA, it's collecting non-custodial information as well. So the profile form itself is the same as the FAFSA, where it's the custodial parent and if they're remarried, their spouse, but then there is a non-custodial profile, and it's a completely separate process, and it gets sent separately to the non-custodial parent. You just provide an email address so that they don't see information from either side. In the case where a student does not have contact with their non-custodial parent, sometimes we hear of that. That is something where each individual school would need to be contacted and to find out what their process is to waive a non-custodial parent. Every school will have their own individual process. So just speaking with the financial aid office at a school. There is a recording, if you wanted to watch it on MIFA, about filling that out. Again, it does ask for more, so it's going to ask for some of the same information. It's going to ask about that 2018 tax information. It's also going to ask for an estimate of where 19 is going to land, and then it's going to say, and what do you think, 2020 is going to look like? It does ask about debt. It does ask about your home, your primary residence. That doesn't mean that every school is going to use that information. Example, when I was at Harvard, that's a standard question on the form. We never brought that home residence, the equity, we never used that in the asset calculation ever. So each school will be individual in what they may or may not do. And most schools don't put, if they are using some bit of home equity, it is some of it. It's not 100%. What other tidbits about the profile? Schools have the ability to select additional questions. So if the form itself isn't enough, you'll end up, as you get to the end of the form, based on the schools that you're applying to, and there's some additional questions that you need to answer. And so be ready for that at the end of the application. And last, an institution themselves may have their own financial aid application. I actually just got rid of the financial aid application that Simmons was using along with the FAFSA form, because in my eyes, I saw it as a stumbling block for all of our students. It really wasn't giving us any great information, and students either didn't realize it was there and they needed to fill it out, or what have you, and it was a pretty short form, so I got rid of that. But when I've sat with families and gone through this process, I remember sitting down and I knew the schools the student was going to apply to, and one of them was Endicott, and I went on the website and, did my typical, what I tell people to do is, research. And so I said, as we were filling out the FAFSA and the profile, and I said, oh, did you do there was a Endicott application. Like, oh, I didn't know that was there. And when I used that example one time, a couple of years ago at a presentation, someone came up afterwards and said, oh, my daughter's applying to Endicott. Thank you for, sharing that. So again, make sure you're researching, what it is that schools are requiring. So much gets pushed out, at least, maybe it's just because I work here, but just about that FAFSA form. But make sure you know what each school is requiring. Also, some schools may require that you automatically send in copies of tax returns. Again, that's what used to happen at Harvard. It was the profile, it was a FAFSA, and you had to also provide copies of tax returns, W-2 forms. That was standard. Not saying that that's at every school, but some schools may require more than other schools, so just know what it is that's required. So after you apply, what's going to happen is the institutions are going to receive the information from the FAFSA. As I said, typically it takes about 2 days because it has to go through some checks. The only time that it would take more than that is if, let's say the FAFSA wasn't fully signed. So let's say the student signed it and the parent hadn't yet signed it, or neither of them signed it and they just submitted it. What happens is it gets held up in just kind of waiting for the signature for about 7 days. If it still hasn't received the signature, it will push the information on to the institutions. And then the institutions then continue to have to follow up with a family to sign that form. The state, as long as you have put in that you are that the student's a Massachusetts resident, the state of Massachusetts is going to get the information as well to figure out whether or not the student is eligible for a Mass grant. Students and parents, if they've put an email address, are going to receive something called a student aid report. This is from the FAFSA form. It's just a listing of everything that was filled out on the form. Look through it. I've had people who didn't realize they put an extra zero and it was 100,000 in assets where it was really 10,000. So make sure you look through that information and that everything is accurate and correct. You can always go in and make updates, so don't fear if something's there that you can't update it and change it. It's going to, typically they're going to be received by email. So a difference with also with the profile as opposed to the FAFSA is that on the FAFSA there's no place at all to explain anything. On the profile, there is a section where you can type in some information to explain something, but on the FAFSA, there's not. So if there are any special circumstances that you think the financial aid office should know because the data on the FAFSA doesn't portray the reality of your situation, you need to communicate that with each individual office and find out what their process is. So let me give you an example. Now that we've moved to prior year, in October of 2019, or even January or February of 2019, when all of a sudden one of the parents has lost a job or has had some sort of medical crisis, and the 2018 income information is drastically different, right, than where they are right now, what their current reality is, that would be a situation where you could reach out to the school and see if the school could utilize something that we're given by the federal government, which is called professional judgment, so we can make a change. The school is going to look for documentation. So if things have happened, keep documentation of things like medical bills or, a layoff notice or something like that. But that would be a situation where you could get in touch with the school, and it's up to their, whatever their process is. Oftentimes, there is a well laid out process. Might be on their website, might just be a phone call and find out what it is and what is required to actually appeal. Many times they're going to say, you know what, wait until you get the award and then you can appeal. Here's what the process is. You're going to have to write some sort of letter. You're going to have to provide some sort of documentation, and then we can see about making some sort of change. But all of that goes through the individual financial aid office. I already mentioned this verification. So that is, again, through the FAFSA and filling that out. You'll be alerted on the student aid report if it's been selected for verification. There's nothing you need to do at that point in time. The college is going to follow up with you and let you know if there's anything else you need to provide. The items we need to verify are the items on the tax return, child support, household size, so typically if you've already done the data retrieval tool, typically it's a process of filling out a form that the school has on their website, a verification worksheet, and just kind of filling that information out. Some schools will not award if they do not have that in place because they want to make sure the award they go out with is accurate. And some schools will go ahead and award an estimated award and then say, but we're going to follow up and we're not going to finalize it until we've gone through that process of verification. So again, each school is different, but they will communicate. Even though you find out on that student aid report, the school will communicate with you and just tell you what that process is. And as I said in the beginning, the colleges, they're going to review all of the information. They'll be providing an award letter with all of the aid, institutional, federal. Some schools will even estimate state aid if there is going that grant aid because it's based on a formula with the EFC on there as well. So how financial aid decisions are made. So remember back when I was saying I didn't like that slide about the student loan because he hadn't even gotten to the formula yet. So here's where we're getting to what the formula is. So this figure, cost of attendance, this is what you will see on most financial aid office websites. This is a figure that gives the family a more realistic idea of what 1 year costs. So it combines your billed costs, tuition fees, room and board, and then it also provides, provides estimates for books and supplies, any transportation, as well as personal expenses. So those non-billed indirect costs are complete estimates made up by the school. They try to provide something that's somewhat reasonable, but it doesn't mean that those costs are exactly what you will be paying for some of those. When I came to Simmons, when I'm looking at the transportation allowance that we're putting in there, I said, gee, that seems pretty generous for someone traveling from, down the road, really. So they probably would not have that cost. The cost of attendance not only gives the family more of an idea of what 1 year costs, but it also is part of the formula for coming up with financial aid. So even though, like I said, in that one instance, probably a family isn't spending that amount, but it actually ends up generating more of a grant for that family because of those increased costs. The other component of the financial aid formula is the expected family contribution, which I've been talking about, which is the data output. It's going to be on that student aid report you receive after filing the FAFSA form. It's an expected family contribution. The better way to think about it, because it is something that potentially can be shocking to see that figure, and if there are EFC calculators you see down here. And I should point out that this presentation is on MIFA's website. So if you are trying to take pictures or take notes, all of this is on their website, so you can go and download that. But if you want to figure out what your EFC might look like, you can do that on a calculator. So a better way to think of this expected family contribution is an amount the family has the ability to absorb 1 year of college costs, and not thinking of, when you see that figure, like, oh, that's exactly what I can, pull right out of my pocket for that 1 year. Same federal formula. Some colleges will also use that institutional. That would be in utilizing the profile form. They may utilize, and it's slightly different. Honestly, it collects a lot more information, and it typically produces a more generous, I would say, like expected family contribution might be less than what the federal government one is. With financial aid, the premise is that the family has the primary responsibility for paying, and that financial aid is there to help fill in that gap, that difference. The EFC is not necessarily what the family will pay, and it's lowered if a student has more than one child in college. So the formula is taking that cost of attendance of a school, subtracting the expected family contribution, and that is your financial aid eligibility or need. So when I talked about those subsidized loans, so as long as you have a positive figure here, right, that means there's need there, and typically a student is eligible for those subsidized loans. Unless they're awarded some sort of large merit award from the school that exceeds need, then it would be an unsubsidized loan. This slide and the next slide go hand in hand, and really it just highlights the fact that this is an income-driven formula. Some people think, oh, assets really skew it. It is driven by income. So in this example, there's 4 in the family, 1 child in college, and the income is the same for all of these 3 families, and it's the assets that vary. And you can see that the EFC doesn't vary all that much compared to the variety of assets. But when you look at the next slide and look at assets that are all the same and it's the income that's varying, you can see that it's a lot larger jump in the expected family contribution. And again, just highlighting it's an income-driven formula. So how does that formula work? We're looking here at 4 different colleges. Ease of example, it's all the same EFC, and the eligibility for aid varies, right? So probably College A is a private institution, and then you get down to C and D might be a state or a community college, right? So the eligibility is different. What I like to point out in this slide is don't rule out a school just because the cost is high. Again, it's all about researching what the schools have available. There are a lot of tools that you can use, both within a school's website, as well as tools that the federal government has put into place because they collect a lot of data from institutions. So finding out before you completely rule out a school, what would it look like for the cost? Because if College A actually meets all of that green eligibility with financial aid, it could be that College A is more affordable than College B if College B is not able to meet all of that. Yeah. Great question. So the question is, when should you start researching the schools? So I say now, you should. So if I think the perfect time is when a student is doing that research about where do I want to apply. At that time, you can do that research to see what will cost possibly look like for us? So there are lots of tools. Again, I don't know if you were here, but I have these checklists that you can go through, and the first one is researching financial fit. So it gives you these different tools that you can use to figure out what cost might look like, because it will project based on your family and information you input what you might receive as a financial aid award at the school. So it's good to have that information when you're looking at an institution. This slide has never changed. I don't like it because you're never going to see a financial aid award that is in some cylinder. It used to be a barrel, actually, but they continue to love putting this slide in. So here we have an institution that has a cost of attendance of $45,000. And the family, we're using, again, that $5,000 EFC, so that goes in first. The student was awarded grant and scholarship aid, so both of those are free money. Oftentimes, grant is need-based and scholarships are merit-based, although sometimes we see other things, but kind of historically, that's how those two words are used. But either way, it's free money, does not need to be repaid. Then they were awarded the student loan, $3,500. Work study, they've been given an allotment of $2,000. So if you're adding all of that aid up, you'll realize that there is unmet need of $7,500. So you take the cost of attendance, the $45,000, and subtract out that EFC, right? And so that produced need or financial aid eligibility of $40,000. And when you add up the grant and scholarship, student loan, and work study, that's not adding up. It's short by $7,500. So when it was said that the EFC might not be what you're paying, right? For this family, for this institution, the cost now becomes the $5,000 plus the $7,500. You also have to remember, in that cost of attendance, there's estimates in there, so it may not be that full amount that the family is paying. But it very much may be that there is also that additional unmet need. Award letters, and I think this is also a two-slide, that award letters can vary. For ease of example, this is,
We're running out of time.
okay, sorry.
The whole lobby's full, but
Okay,
take a couple
okay,
more minutes.
all right. Okay, speed financial aid. So the cost of attendance is the same for these three schools, just ease of example, but you have College A. So basically, what I say here is don't just look at the bottom line, right? So College A has $32,000 in grants and scholarships, and there's no unmet need. And then, it goes down the line. But if you look at the next, we have College C here, who's, and this, I hope most institutions don't do, but there are some that will do this, that are packaging in a parent loan, which a parent still has to apply for. So I find that just to be trickery. But again, just not looking at that bottom line, you want to know what those details are and making sure, and quite honestly, there are, again, tools that you can use that you input information and that it will spread it out for you so that you have a better sense of, comparing apples to apples. Paying. Just like any large purchase, most people aren't pulling, immediate out of current income. And so some of it might be coming from past income, some from present. Most institutions now have payment plans available, which is excellent because you can stretch the cost over 10 months rather than a fall payment and a spring payment. And then future income, private loans are available. And it doesn't have to be from one of these sources. It can be stretched across all three or for some of them. Yeah, always just, one thing that I just stress, particularly in that first year, is don't forget that there are often more years coming. nothing worse than seeing a family that, is trying to put it all together for that first year, and then that second year realizing this is unsustainable. So another tip that I always give is to have a conversation. I have 2 children. I talk to them all the time. Obviously, specific to your family and in your own situation, but I think if you can have a conversation earlier rather than when they're trying to make a decision within a month of where they're going to go, but just talk about for your family what is reasonable or unreasonable as far as cost is concerned. Additionally, there are other things out there like the mass transfer and the Commonwealth commitment where community colleges have, if the student stays for 2 years, that their credits will automatically transfer to a public institution, and if they maintain a certain GPA, that there's money then to go on to that state school. So research all of the opportunities. Resources. So this is net price calculator. Every institution has that on their website. And so that's something that you can use to figure out costs specific to that school based on information you put in. So based on someone who looks like you financially and what they would have gotten as a package in the year before. Absolutely utilize resources doing things like this. Asking a financial aid office, call the financial aid office and ask them questions. That's what we're here for, is to be able to answer the questions that you have. And then the FAFSA Day I already talked about. That will be happening beginning in October. And again, we've had about 30 sites. So typically the majority of them are in November. And there are seminars that MIFA does for after the acceptance. So if you forget all of this information, and then you have something tangible and in hand, some financial aid offers, they have seminars where they go through that. What you can do now is sign up for the MIFA emails. You can get an FSA ID now, but you could also totally wait, because typically we're doing these programs in October, November timeframe. But if you want to do something now, you can sign up for that. I would say sign up for those emails to get them. Don't start completing applications yet, because that is really once you're in that senior year. And that's it. I'm not going to take any questions, but I will go out in the hall and I will take questions there. Thank you very much.